Imagine yourself in the marble halls of a Macedonian palace, about to witness one of the most disturbing wedding ceremonies of the ancient world. The linen robe scratches against your skin as you watch a woman adjust the golden crown that marks her as queen. Her hands tremble, not from fear, but from anger she's forced to hide like a bitter drink through the marble columns of Pella's palace. The Macedonian nobles gather in the courtyard below. Their voices echo in celebration, convinced they are witnessing her great victory. If only they knew the truth. Before you stands Arsinoe II, one of the most powerful women of her age, marrying her own half-brother, Ptolemy, known as Soter's Thunderbolt. For his ruthless ambition, he clings to her waist with a possessive grip. His arm is too tight, his smile too sharp. The crown he placed on her head only moments ago looks less like a symbol of honor and more like a chain. He has sworn to protect her sons and to recognize them as heirs to the throne of Macedonia that he seized for himself. But you can see the greed in his eyes, the same greed that pushed him to murder Seleucus and claim these lands as his own. What does he truly desire? Not a wife, but the removal of rivals. Her 3 sons from her first marriage are threats to his rule. Despite his smooth promises, you can almost feel the blood already on his hands. The priests chant in Greek, calling on Zeus and Hera to bless this union, an unsettling echo of those divine siblings whose marriage poets once praised. Around them, the nobles act blind to the disgust on her face. This is far from the first time she has been treated like a bargaining piece. At 15, her father Ptolemy gave her in marriage to Lysimachus, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Now at 40, she is once again treated as currency. The wine in her cup tastes like ash. As the ritual toasts are raised around her, the court rejoices, but her mind is already elsewhere, calculating, planning. In the 25 years since she first entered the dangerous world of Hellenistic politics, she has learned one truth. Survival depends on more than beauty or royal birth. It demands strategy, patience, and the strength to do whatever the gods require. As Ptolemy, now styling himself as king, lifts his cup to bless their union, her eyes drift to the crowd. There she notices her eldest son, Ptolemaeus. Unlike his younger brothers, he refused to travel to Pella. Having sensed the trap she, in her desperation, stepped into. His absence may yet save his life. Hers, however, hangs by the thinnest of threads. The irony cuts deep. She, Arsinoe, daughter of the great Ptolemy Soter, the man who carved an empire from the remnants of Alexander's conquests, is now reduced to the role her enemies always claimed for royal women, a pawn in men's games. But they forget, pawn, if it reaches the other side of the board, can become the most dangerous piece of all. The ceremony ends with kisses that taste of poison and promises as fragile as broken pottery. Tonight, as Macedonia welcomes its new queen, she must share a bed with a man who sees her only as a tool for legitimacy, a ruler who views her children as obstacles to be eliminated. But he has no idea who he has married. He does not understand that the blood of Alexander's heirs runs through her veins. He does not realize that she has survived courts far deadlier than his, and he cannot see that she has already begun weaving a web that will either secure her survival or drag them both into ruin. Before we dive further into this forgotten story of survival and betrayal in the shadow of empires, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most powerful dynasties, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And please leave a comment below to share where you're listening from. I'm always amazed that we can explore these ancient stories together from so many corners of the world, connected across time by our fascination with power and the women who paid its price. The story of Arsinoe does not begin with love or passion, but with the cold calculations of empire. Born around 316 BCE in the shining new city of Alexandria, she entered a world where bloodline was both privilege and prison. Her father, Ptolemy the Cernsoter, the first of his dynasty, had been one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. He was the man who helped carry Alexander's body from Babylon, and then carved out a kingdom of his own from the chaos that followed. In the marble corridors of the Ptolemaic palace, young Arsinoe learned early that her beauty and her life did not truly belong to her. They belonged to the dynasty. Her stepmother, Berenice I, had already shown that a woman could rise from obscurity to queenship through intelligence and charm. She whispered to Arsinoe stories of goddesses and heroines, but the reality was far more brutal. In the world of the Diadochi, Alexander's successors, daughters were living diplomacy, exchanged like treaties, made flesh. The Alexandria of Arsinoe's childhood was a city intoxicated with ambition. The great library was taking shape, drawing scholars from every corner of the Mediterranean. Ships from India and Arabia crowded the harbor, heavy with silk, spices, and ivory. But beneath the polished marble facades and the lofty debates of philosophers, the city pulsed with tension. The Ptolemies were Greeks ruling Egyptians, Macedonians claiming the mantle of pharaohs. Every day brought new challenges to their legitimacy. Arsinoe grew up bilingual, speaking Greek in the palace, while learning Egyptian from the servants who raised her. She watched the temple rituals, saw priests carry out ceremonies that stretched back more than 3,000 years. For her, these ancient traditions were not relics of the past, but a constant reminder that her dynasty ruled a land older, deeper, and more sacred than anything Macedonia had ever known. Even as a child, she understood that Egypt was unlike the other Hellenistic kingdoms. Here, the king was not just a ruler, but a god, an earthly embodiment of divine power. And gods, as every Egyptian knew, followed their own rules when it came to marriage and bloodline. The priests told stories of Isis and Osiris, divine siblings whose union had shaped the very order of the cosmos. Isis, the great mother goddess, had wed her brother Osiris, lord of the underworld, and from their love came the foundation of Egyptian religion. To the native Egyptians, sibling marriage among the gods was not scandalous, but sacred. To the Greeks, however, it was something unthinkable, a violation of the natural order. When Arsinoe was 15, her father made the decision that would define her destiny. The year was 301 BCE, and the Diadochi were still battling for the fractured remnants of Alexander's empire. Lysimachus, king of Thrace, needed allies against his rivals, while Ptolemy or Soter needed security for his eastern borders. The solution was clear: marriage. Lysimachus was 55 years old, a hardened veteran who had fought at Alexander's side from the Danube to the Indus. His body carried the scars of 100 battles, including the famous encounter with a lion that had earned him his nickname. To the young Arsinoe, he must have appeared as something out of legend, terrifying and awe-inspiring in equal measure. The wedding took place in the ancient city of Sardis, once the capital of the Persian Empire. Picture the scene: a great hall crowded with nobles from across the Greek world, their voices echoing beneath gilded walls. Arsinoe stood in robes of Egyptian linen, dyed with Tyrian purple, her dark hair crowned with a diadem that glittered in the light of 1,000 oil lamps. She was beautiful in the way of teenage girls, full of promise, intelligence shining in her eyes, though carefully masked by fear. Lysimachus placed the ring on her finger with the same hands that had once held Alexander's stirrup. He recited the ancient words of the Greek marriage ritual, but behind his solemn tone, his eyes were already cold and calculating. This was not a union of hearts, but of armies, not a romance, but a treaty written in flesh and blood. As they shared the ceremonial wine, Arsinoe tasted her future, bitter and intoxicating in equal measure. The wedding feast stretched on for 3 days. Poets recited verses comparing the young bride to Helen of Troy and Penelope the Faithful. Musicians played harps and flutes, while dancers from across the empire entertained the gathered nobles. But beneath the music and celebration lay a harsher truth. Arsinoe was no longer only a princess of Egypt. She was now queen of Thrace, drawn fully into the lethal game of Hellenistic politics. Her new husband's court was dangerous terrain. Lysimachus had ruled for more than 2 decades, but enemies pressed in on every side. To the north, the Thracian tribes tested his borders, their warriors hungry for Greek gold. To the east, the vast Seleucid Empire stretched from Anatolia to India, its king Seleucus forever probing for weakness. To the south, the other Diadochi watched, waiting for the smallest crack in his defenses. In this climate, Arsinoe learned the first great lesson of her life. Survival required more than beauty or charm. It demanded the ability to read the shifting currents of power, to know when to advance and when to retreat, when to speak and when to remain silent. She studied her husband's courtiers like a hawk tracks its prey, teaching herself to decipher the subtle gestures that revealed loyalty or betrayal. Within a year, she was pregnant. In 299 BCE, she gave birth to her first child, a son named Ptolemy. His arrival changed everything. Arsinoe was no longer only a wife, she was a mother, and with motherhood came the chance to build her own dynasty. 2 more sons followed quickly: Lysimachus, the younger, in 297 BCE, and Philip in 294 BCE. Each birth increased her standing at court, each child both a blessing and a bargaining chip in the brutal game of succession. But Lysimachus already had an heir, his elder son Agathocles, born of his first marriage. As Arsinoe's boys grew from infants to toddlers. The question of inheritance began to overshadow everything. Who would claim the kingdom? The elder son of common birth, or the younger sons of a princess of Egypt? The whispers began quietly, carried on the lips of servants and courtiers. Talk of the Egyptian queen's ambition, and the growing threat she and her children represented to the old order. The nobles split into factions, some rallying behind Agathocles, others beginning to see opportunity in Arsinoe's younger sons. She now stood at the center of a tangled web of intrigue that grew more dangerous with every passing year. Slowly, she grasped the full reality of her situation. She was not just a queen, she was a foreign queen. Her loyalty was always in question, and her children were viewed as threats to the established order. The same court that had once greeted her with applause now studied her with suspicion. Every word she spoke was picked apart for hidden meaning. Every gesture weighed as possible evidence of conspiracy. The pressure was suffocating. Imagine being a young woman in her 20s, far from home, responsible for 3 small children, surrounded by enemies who smiled to her face, but whispered venom the moment she turned her back. The burden of expectation pressed on her like a physical weight. Her father had staked Egypt's future on this marriage. Failure would not simply mean personal disgrace. It would weaken the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. So, Arsinoe adapted. She learned to play the game. She built alliances among the court ladies, using Egyptian gold to secure their loyalty. She patronized philosophers and poets, gathering around her a circle of intellectuals who celebrated her wisdom and beauty. She took part in local religious rituals, honoring the gods of Thrace, while still quietly maintaining her own Egyptian traditions. Step by step, she began to carve out a power base that existed independent of her husband. The decisive moment came in 283 BCE, when Arsinoe's eldest son, Ptolemy, turned 16. By Greek custom, that meant he was now old enough to be considered for succession. The question could no longer be avoided. Who would inherit the kingdom of Lysimachus? The old king was now 73. His hair had turned white as snow. His steps faltered with age. He had ruled for 39 years, longer than Alexander himself had lived, and the decades had carved their mark into his face. Yet his mind remained sharp, and he understood the gravity of the decision before him. Support Agathocles, his eldest son, and he risked alienating his powerful Egyptian allies. Support Arsinoe's sons, and he risked civil war with Agathocles' faction. Either way, the choice would shape the fate of his dynasty. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. Some claimed that Arsinoe seduced her husband into removing his rival. Others argued that she merely laid out the political realities he could not afford to ignore. The truth, as always with these ancient tales, was likely far more complicated than either version. What is certain is this. In 283 BCE, Agathocles was arrested on charges of treason. The evidence was flimsy: a handful of intercepted letters, a few secret meetings, and the testimony of witnesses who may have been bribed or threatened. But in the ruthless world of Hellenistic politics, the appearance of guilt was often enough. Within days, Agathocles was dead, executed on the orders of his own father. The court was thrown into shock. Agathocles had been popular among the nobles, a proven commander who had fought at his father's side in countless campaigns. His death sent a brutal message. Arsinoe's sons were now the heirs, and any who stood against them did so at their peril. But the triumph carried a heavy price. The killing of Agathocles split the kingdom. Many of the old nobles, the men who had served Lysimachus since the earliest days, turned against Arsinoe, branding her a foreign enchantress who had poisoned their king's mind. Whispers spread, sharper and more vicious with each retelling. They called her a second Medea, a woman destined to ruin all she touched in her hunger for power. Beyond the palace walls, the enemies of the kingdom smelled weakness. Seleucus I, the last of Alexander's original bodyguards, moved against Lysimachus's eastern holdings. The Thracian tribes pressed harder at the northern frontier. Pirates raided the coasts, emboldened by the kingdom's inward collapse. By 281 BCE, the crisis reached its breaking point. Seleucus invaded Anatolia with a vast army, declaring he came to avenge the murdered Agathocles. Lysimachus, despite his failing body, marched out to meet him. At the Battle of Corupedium, two men in their 70s, both veterans of Alexander's wars, faced each other in the last great clash of their generation. For Lysimachus, it ended in ruin. His army, hollowed by years of division, collapsed under the Seleucid assault. The old king himself was cut down in the melee, his body pierced by a dozen spears. With his death, the kingdom of Thrace disintegrated like a house built on sand, and Arsinoe, only 35 years old, stood widowed and vulnerable, trapped in the most perilous moment of her life. She had 3 young sons to protect, but no army to defend them. The kingdom her husband had built was falling apart, torn to pieces by ambitious generals and vengeful nobles. Seleucus was advancing on the capital, and there seemed to be nowhere left to run. But Arsinoe was not a woman who survived 20 years of court intrigue by waiting helplessly. Even as the news of her husband's death reached her, she was already planning her escape. She gathered her most loyal supporters, secured whatever treasure she could carry, and prepared to flee. The irony was bitter. The same woman who had once been carried to Sardis in a bridal litter now faced the reality of running for her life. She had played the game of power as skillfully as any man. She had sacrificed her stepson to secure her children's future, endured decades of suspicion and hatred, and now, in the moment of crisis, she had no choice but to run. The journey to safety was harrowing. Picture a royal caravan moving under the cover of night, torches flickering in the darkness, horses' hooves muffled by sand. Arsinoe rode with her 3 sons, Ptolemy, now 17, Lysimachus, 15, and Philip, 12. No longer princes, they were fugitives. Their royal robes had been exchanged for the rough garments of travelers. Behind them, the kingdom burned. Seleucus had seized the capital, and his men were systematically hunting down anyone connected to the old regime. Arsinoe's allies were being executed or enslaved. Cities that once welcomed her now threw open their gates to her enemies. But Seleucus himself would not live long enough to enjoy his victory. Even as Arsinoe pressed westward, another drama unfolded. Her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus, the son of her father's first marriage, had been living in exile at Seleucus's court. The old king had promised to help restore him, to place him on the throne of Macedonia. But Ceraunus was impatient, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. At the very moment Seleucus prepared to cross into Europe, Ceraunus struck. He murdered his host and benefactor, seizing the army and proclaiming himself king of Macedonia. Thus, the last of Alexander's original companions fell, not in battle, but at the hands of a man young enough to be his grandson. The news reached Arsinoe as she sheltered in a harbor town along the Aegean coast. Her half-brother, the same man passed over in Egypt's succession, who had nursed his grievances for decades in foreign courts, was now king of Macedonia, and astonishingly, he was offering her marriage. The proposal arrived by messenger, his voice dripping with honeyed words of reconciliation and family unity. Ptolemy Ceraunus promised to recognize Arsinoe's sons as his heirs, to restore to them the kingdom that their father Lysimachus had lost. He spoke of love and destiny, insisting that the Ptolemaic bloodline must rule in Macedonia just as it ruled in Egypt. Arsinoe listened with a face carved from stone. She had heard such assurances before, from Lysimachus, from flattering courtiers, from ambitious generals. She knew the weight of royal promises and how easily they could be cast aside when expedience demanded it. Yet she also knew she had no real choice. Her sons needed protection, and she needed a throne from which to secure it. Accepting Ceraunus's proposal was the most difficult decision of her life. This time she was no naive girl, but a woman of 40, hardened by decades of betrayal and the ruthless games of men. She knew marrying her half-brother was a desperate gamble, a trap she entered with eyes open. But what alternative was there? Refusal meant endless exile, wandering from court to court, watching her children grow into dependent pensioners, sustained only by others' charity. Acceptance, at least, held the faint hope that blood might count for something, that family ties could outweigh political calculation. Before leaving for Macedonia, Arsinoe made one final, heartbreaking choice. She sent her eldest son, Ptolemy, away to the court of a distant ally. If disaster struck, at least one child might survive to carry on the bloodline. It was a mother's wisdom, born of bitter experience and desperate love. The wedding took place in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia, beneath the shadow of the palace where Alexander himself had been raised. The ceremony was magnificent. Ceraunus spared no expense in displaying his legitimacy, yet beneath the gold and purple, the music, and the feasting lay the cold reality of political necessity. Arsinoe stood beside her half-brother as priests performed the sacred rites. They were both children of Ptolemy I, but by different mothers, products of a dynasty built on multiple marriages. In Egypt, such unions were not scandalous, but sanctified, reflections of divine pairings meant to preserve cosmic order. But to the Greeks, the match reeked of desperation rather than destiny. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, but the honeymoon was measured in hours. On their wedding night, Ceraunus revealed his true purpose. He had not married Arsinoe out of love. nor even for lasting alliance, but to eliminate the threat her sons posed to his rule. The betrayal was swift and merciless. Soldiers loyal to Cyrannus stormed the palace quarters where Arsinoe's two younger sons slept. Lysimachus, aged 15, and Philip, aged 12, were dragged from their beds and slaughtered before their mother's eyes. Their blood pooled across the marble floors of the same palace where Alexander had once played as a child. Arsinoe's screams echoed through the halls of Pella, a sound that would haunt the palace for generations. But grief was a luxury she could not afford. Even as her sons' bodies were dragged away, she was already planning her escape. The woman who had survived 2 decades of court intrigue would not allow this betrayal to be her end. She remembered her father's example. Ptolemy, I had survived impossible odds by moving quicker, striking harder, and being more ruthless than his enemies. Now, with guards watching her every movement and servants reporting her every word, Arsinoe began to devise her own survival. The escape that followed was worthy of legend. With the aid of loyal attendants and the underground network of slaves and freedmen that existed in every royal household, she slipped out of Pella in the dead of night. Disguised as a servant, her royal robes replaced with coarse wool, her jeweled diadem hidden beneath a plain headscarf, she walked away from the palace that had become her prison. Behind her, a decoy remained, a slave woman who resembled the queen closely enough to delay discovery and buy precious hours. The flight to safety was a nightmare of narrow escapes and constant danger. Tyrannus's soldiers scoured the countryside, determined to capture the queen who had humiliated their king by slipping through his trap. Arsinoe moved silently through the shadows, sheltered by a network of allies who risked everything to protect her. Some helped out of loyalty, others for gold, but all knew they were taking part in a drama that would echo through history. Her destination was the island of Samothrace, sacred place where the ancient mystery cults offered sanctuary to the persecuted. Its temples were protected by customs older than the Greek cities, older even than the Macedonian kingdom. Not even Cyrannus would dare violate the holy precinct of the great gods. As her ship neared the rocky shores of Samothrace, Arsinoe must have felt the crushing weight of her losses. She had been married 3 times, had borne 3 sons, and had ruled as queen of 2 kingdoms. And yet, on that windswept island, she arrived not as a sovereign, but as a fugitive mother stripped of almost everything. Now she was a refugee, dependent on the charity of priests and the protection of ancient laws. 2 of her sons were dead, murdered by her own half-brother. The third was in exile, his future uncertain. But Arsinoe was not a woman who yielded to disaster. Even as she mourned her lost children, she was already planning her next move. She still had one card to play, one last chance to rebuild her life and secure her legacy. Her youngest brother, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, now ruled Egypt as pharaoh. If she could reach Alexandria, if she could persuade him to take her in, she might yet find a way to survive. The voyage from Samothrace to Alexandria was perilous. Cyrannus's warships prowled the northern Aegean, while pirates haunted the southern waters. But Arsinoe had grown resourceful, practiced in deception. She traveled in disguise, sometimes as a merchant's wife, sometimes as a humble pilgrim seeking religious instruction. The beauty that had once been her greatest weapon was now hidden under coarse garments and careful makeup. When she finally entered the great harbor of Alexandria, the city of her birth, she must have felt a storm of emotions. This was home, yet also the place where her exile had begun nearly 40 years earlier. The palace, where she had once played as a child, was now ruled by a brother she barely knew, Ptolemy II. Philadelphus, at 36 years old, was a very different ruler from his father. A scholar and administrator, he had inherited a rich kingdom, but not the daring military genius of Ptolemy III. Egypt thrived under his cautious governance, its trade routes secured, its temples splendid, but the pharaoh himself was hesitant, preferring stability over risk. The reunion of brother and sister was tense, heavy with the weight of decades apart and mutual suspicion. Arsinoe was no longer the young princess carried away in a bridal litter to Lysimachus's court. She was a woman hardened by tragedy, marked by betrayal, desperate for a second chance. For his part, Ptolemy II saw in her both promise and peril, a sister who could serve as a powerful ally, or a rival whose ambition might threaten his throne. Their negotiations were delicate. Arsinoe needed sanctuary, but she also demanded a position worthy of her experience, her royal blood, and her unbroken will. She could not simply retreat into a comfortable exile, nor live quietly as a dependent relative. Arsinoe had been a queen, a mother, and a strategist in the great game of power. She would never accept fading into obscurity. The solution, when it came, was as shocking as it was brilliant. Ptolemy II of Philadelphus was married to Arsinoe I, a woman who had given him children, but lacked the political skill to be his true partner in rule. If he divorced her and instead married his sister, he would gain not just a queen, but a co-ruler, someone seasoned in the brutal realities of Hellenistic politics, someone who understood dynastic survival better than almost anyone alive. The idea of sibling marriage was not unprecedented in Egypt. For over 3,000 years, the pharaohs had occasionally married their sisters, following the model of the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris, the divine pair who ruled the underworld, were brother and sister. Their union was not seen as incest, but as sacred, a reflection of cosmic order that preserved the universe. But the Ptolemies were also Greek, and to the Greeks, sibling marriage was abhorrent. It defied nature, offended the gods, and endangered social order. No Ptolemaic ruler had ever married a full sister before, though unions with half-siblings or cousins had occurred. To cross this line was to invite outrage. Ptolemy II understood the enormity of the step. He knew he was setting a precedent that would define his dynasty for centuries. But he also knew the advantages. By marrying Arsinoe II, he would be claiming the authority of the pharaohs themselves. He would show the world that the Ptolemies were not simply Greek monarchs ruling a foreign land, but true heirs to Egypt's most sacred traditions. The announcement of their betrothal sent shockwaves across the Greek world. Poets and philosophers debated the morality of sibling marriage, while rulers weighed its political consequences. Some dismissed it as Egyptian decadence, proof that the Ptolemies had been corrupted by their adopted kingdom. Others saw it as a masterstroke of propaganda, a daring claim to legitimacy unmatched by any other Hellenistic dynasty. The wedding itself was staged as a dazzling spectacle, designed to proclaim the divine nature of the union. The ceremony took place in the greater Temple of Ptah at Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, where pharaohs had been crowned for millennia. Every detail was Egyptian rather than Greek, underscoring the sacred authority of the couple. There, Arsinoe, now 41 years old, stood beside her 36-year-old brother as the high priest performed the timeless rites before gods and men. The sister and the brother were joined, not merely as husband and wife, but as pharaoh and queen, as divine rulers embodying the eternal order of Egypt. She wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the timeless emblem of pharaonic authority, first donned by rulers in the Age of Menes. Her brother stood beside her in full royal regalia, the crook and flail, symbols of the pharaoh's dual role as protector and shepherd of his people. The hymns sung that day were ancient beyond imagination, texts already old when the pyramids rose on the Giza plateau. They spoke of divine marriage, of the sacred union between earth and sky, order and chaos. They proclaimed that the royal couple were no longer merely mortal, but gods in their own right, worthy of worship and eternal veneration. The Greeks of Alexandria were scandalized, yet they were also awed. Never before had they witnessed such pageantry, such raw splendor drawn from the depths of pharaonic religion. The Ptolemies had long balanced their Greek and Egyptian identities, but now they declared themselves fully Egyptian, fully divine. The marriage remade both partners. Ptolemy II became Philadelphus, the brother lover, a title that was at once boast and proclamation. Arsinoe II became Philadelphus, the sister wife who shared in the divine majesty of Pharaoh. Together, they were hailed as Theoi Philadelphoi, the sibling-loving gods. Rulers of Egypt as Isis and Osiris ruled the underworld. But this was more than ceremony. Arsinoe brought to the marriage decades of ruthless experience in the courts of Lysimachus and the Seleucids. She had watched kingdoms rise and collapse, had survived betrayals and shifting alliances, had mastered the art of survival in a world where weakness meant annihilation. For the first time, she could wield that knowledge without fear. As queen, she worked with tireless energy. She accompanied Ptolemy on tours of the land, arbitrating disputes and smoothing the tensions among the many peoples of Egypt. She patronized scholars, poets, and philosophers, sustaining Alexandria's supremacy as the intellectual capital of the world. Yet her greatest triumph was in foreign policy. The Hellenistic world had grown perilous. Rome was pushing into the western Mediterranean, while the Parthians advanced against the eastern borders of the Seleucid Empire. Navigating this turbulence required brilliance, and Arsinoe understood the power of imagery. Under her direction, she and Ptolemy appeared on coins and monuments as gods, their likenesses entwined with those of Egypt's ancient deities. They were shown receiving offerings, blessing the land, upholding cosmic balance through their sacred union. The strategy worked. Egyptians began to see them not as foreign conquerors, but as true pharaohs, heirs to a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. Greeks, though unsettled, could not deny the majesty of the display. The divine marriage had given the Ptolemies something no other Hellenistic dynasty possessed: legitimacy rooted in both Greek cunning and Egyptian eternity. She held a claim to authority that was both political and religious, both Greek and Egyptian. But the personal price she paid was immense. Arsinoe had given up everything to reach this point. She had lost her first marriage, been separated from her children, and sacrificed her youth. She had endured long years of exile and betrayal, watched her sons murdered in front of her, and fled across the Mediterranean to save her life. Now, in the final years of her life, she had finally gained the ultimate reward: a share in divine power, a place among the gods themselves. The marriage produced no children, but it did not need to. Ptolemy II already had heirs from his first marriage, and Arsinoe was well past the age of bearing children. What mattered most was not new heirs, but the transformation this union created: political, religious, and symbolic. Through it, the Ptolemies became something different, something beyond ordinary human rulers. Standing in the palace of Alexandria, wearing the crown of the pharaohs, Arsinoe must have reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought her here. Once, she had been a pawn in her father's diplomatic maneuvers, married off as a trophy to an older king. She had been a victim of her half-brother's ruthless ambitions, forced to watch her children slaughtered and to live in constant fear. Yet she had also fought back, using every weapon she had: her beauty, her intelligence, her resilience, and her sheer determination to survive, and in the end, to triumph. The tradition she created would outlast her by centuries. Future Ptolemaic rulers would follow her model, marrying their siblings in order to maintain divine authority within the dynasty. That practice would reach its height in the reign of the most famous of all Ptolemaic queens, Cleopatra VII, who married two of her brothers in succession and used her sacred lineage to confront Rome itself. But that is another story. For now, we see Arsinoe in her moment of victory. We cannot overlook the cost. She had been forced into incest not once, but twice. From childhood through middle age, she was used as a tool of dynastic politics. And yet, she turned that role into power. She transformed her suffering into strength, her victimhood into triumph. The same woman who once cowered in a Macedonian palace while her children were murdered now stood as a goddess in Egypt, crowned with the authority of the pharaohs. Her power unquestioned, her legacy secured. She had paid the highest price for power, but she had also earned the ultimate prize: immortality. Not only in the memory of historians, but in the living religious traditions of the people she ruled. As the sun set over the Nile, stretching long shadows across the palace gardens, Arsinoe must have felt a deep, private satisfaction. She had endured the unendurable, defied impossible odds, and remade herself from victim into goddess. The girl who had been sold into marriage at 15 had become the woman who redefined what it meant to be a Ptolemaic queen. Her bloodline would, not survive through her own children, but through the institution she had created. The practice of sibling marriage, once shocking and without precedent, became the defining mark of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Future queens would look back to her as the founder of their tradition, the one who showed that survival was possible, even in the most desperate of circumstances. But the cost, the terrible, heartbreaking cost, would never be forgotten. Every future dynastic union carried the echo of her sacrifice. Every divine ritual recalled the price she had paid. She had saved the dynasty, yet lost herself in the process. She became less a person than a symbol, less a woman than a goddess. The tragic irony was complete. In trying to protect her children, she had been forced to give up her humanity. In fighting to remain a mother, she became a myth. The woman who had wanted nothing more than to keep her family safe instead laid the foundations for a tradition that would consume countless families over the centuries. As night descended on Alexandria, the city moved into the rhythm that would define it for 300 years. In the palace, the divine couple carried out their sacred duties, upholding cosmic order through their union. In the temples, priests prayed for the health and prosperity of the Theoi Adelphoi. In the streets, merchants, scholars, farmers, and fishermen went about their daily lives under the protection of rulers who had once been mortal. And in the shadows of memory, the ghosts of two murdered boys seemed to play in the gardens of their youth, their laughter echoing across the centuries, a haunting reminder of the price that power always exacts. The tradition Arsinoe had created would outlive her, but it could never escape the blood on which it was built. The story of the Ptolemies was far from over. The dynasty would endure for another 2.5 centuries, producing rulers remembered as both brilliant and depraved. Yet all of them would trace their sacred authority back to this moment, to this woman, to this terrible but necessary transformation of victim into goddess. The years that followed the divine marriage revealed the delicate balance between power and its cost. Arsinoe, now in her 40s, embraced her role as pharaoh queen with fierce determination. She knew this might be her last chance to carve her place in history. From her earlier marriages, she had learned that survival was not simply about endurance. It was about becoming indispensable. Her first great test came in 274 BCE with the outbreak of the First Syrian War. The Seleucid Empire, weakened after the assassination of Seleucus, was fractured by competing claimants. Antiochus the Thesperus, the legitimate heir, faced rivals and rebellious governors, eager to seize power in the empire's turmoil. For Egypt, the unfolding chaos in the Seleucid Empire was both a danger and an opportunity, the chance to reclaim territories once lost to Seleucus, but also the risk of being pulled into a long and costly war. In these tense deliberations, Arsinoe proved indispensable. Her years in the courts of both Lysimachus and Seleucus had trained her to read the subtle language of dynastic politics. She understood how ambitious generals thought, how they measured risk and reward, and how they could be either manipulated or destroyed. When Ptolemy II wavered between caution and boldness, it was Arsinoe who provided the decisive counsel that would guide Egypt's strategy for decades. Standing with him on the palace balcony in Alexandria, watching the warships being prepared for departure, she pressed her case. Strike now, she urged her brother husband. Antiochus is weak, his empire fractured. But weakness never lasts. Give him time, and he will consolidate his power. Strike while he bleeds from a dozen wounds. Her words carried the authority of bitter memory. She had seen what hesitation cost. Lysimachus had delayed in moving against Agathocles, and that hesitation destroyed him. Seleucus had acted quickly when he assassinated his rival, but then grew complacent, giving his enemies time to rally. The lesson was unmistakable. In the brutal arena of Hellenistic politics, timing was everything. The war that followed vindicated her judgment. Egyptian armies swept through Palestine and southern Syria, recovering territories that had been lost for generations. Cities long burdened by Seleucid taxation greeted the Ptolemaic soldiers as liberators. Arsinoe herself accompanied several campaigns, her presence both inspiring the troops and ensuring that Egypt's victories were firmly secured. But her genius extended beyond the battlefield. Arsinoe understood what many rulers of her age did not: the immense power of narrative, of shaping how rule was perceived and remembered. Under her influence, the Alexandrian court became a vibrant center of artistic and literary production, rivaling the great days of Periclean Athens. Poets like Theocritus were commissioned to write verses comparing the royal couple to Zeus and Hera, emphasizing the divine legitimacy of their union while framing it in terms acceptable to Greek audiences. As Zeus, king of the immortals, loves Hera, his sister wife, Theocritus wrote, so does Ptolemy love his bride. The comparison was deliberate and calculated. If the king of the gods could marry his sister, then surely mortal pharaohs could do the same. At the same time, Arsinoe was careful to balance Greek rationalizations with Egyptian tradition. Along the temples of the Nile, she and Ptolemy were depicted as Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings whose sacred union sustained the cosmic order. Hieroglyphic inscriptions described their marriage in terms that had been revered for millennia, emphasizing continuity with the pharaonic past rather than the appearance of foreign novelty. The queen's influence soon reached into every corner of court life. Arsinoe restructured the royal household, introducing new ceremonies and protocols designed to highlight the divine majesty of the ruling couple. She became a patron of the great library of Alexandria, ensuring that scholars from across the Mediterranean flocked to Egypt to teach, debate, and preserve knowledge. She sponsored the construction of splendid temples and public buildings, monuments that proclaimed Ptolemaic power to subjects and foreign envoys alike. Yet perhaps her most delicate and important work lay within the royal family itself. Arsinoe understood that dynasties could be destroyed as easily from within as by any outside enemy. With this in mind, she began carefully integrating her stepchildren, the children of Ptolemy II's first marriage, into the new order she was shaping. The crown prince, the future Ptolemy III, was still a boy when his father had set aside his mother to marry Arsinoe. Many queens might have treated him with suspicion, even hostility, but Arsinoe was wise enough to see that her own survival rested on his eventual loyalty. She honored him, gave him a place of dignity, and, in private, offered guidance that would shape his character. "You are the future of this dynasty," she told the young prince one evening during a quiet conversation. "Your father and I are only guardians of the throne until the day comes when you claim it. Remember, power is never simply inherited. It is earned day by day, decision by decision. The gods may have made you a prince, but only your own deeds will make you a king." These lessons came from Arsinoe's own bitter experiences. She had seen too many royal heirs grow up believing that their birth alone entitled them to rule, only to discover that bloodlines meant little without the strength to defend their crown. The boy who would later reign as Ptolemy III absorbed her teachings deeply, and they would serve him well once his time on the throne arrived. As the years passed, Arsinoe stepped into roles that few women, and even few men, had ever dared to claim. She attended meetings of the Royal Council, where her voice carried the same authority as seasoned generals and administrators. She received foreign ambassadors herself, using her mastery of languages and customs to steer delicate negotiations. She even performed religious rites, traditionally reserved only for the pharaoh, sharing in the sacred duties that bound Egypt to its gods. The transformation was extraordinary. The woman who had once been a pawn in her father's diplomatic games had risen to the rank of a sovereign in her own right, standing on equal footing with the most powerful rulers of the Mediterranean. Kings sought her favor, knowing that her influence over Ptolemy II was absolute. Scholars dedicated their works to her, honoring her as a patron worthy of eternal praise. Among the people, she was revered as a living goddess, believed to bless the fertility of the fields and the prosperity of Egypt's cities. Yet Arsinoe's greatest achievement lay not only in what she built during her lifetime, but in the precedent she established for generations of queens to come. Before her marriage to Ptolemy II, royal women in the Hellenistic world were valued mostly as mothers, wives, and diplomatic tools. They influenced events from behind the curtain, but rarely held official power or sacred titles. Arsinoe changed this forever. She created what historians later called Ptolemaic queenship, a model of female authority that blended ancient Egyptian ideals of divine kingship with Hellenistic ideas of royal power. Future rulers, including queens like Cleopatra II and Cleopatra VII, would expand upon her foundation, but all would look back to Arsinoe as the originator of their strength. The irony was clear to those who knew her story. The woman once forced into incestuous marriages as a tool of male ambition had turned those very marriages into instruments of unprecedented female authority. She had taken the chains that once bound her and reforged them into a crown. By the time she entered her 50s, Arsinoe began to reflect on her legacy. She had no children of her own, but she had built something greater than a bloodline, an institution, a tradition, a vision of queenship that would endure long after her death. The sibling marriage she shared with Ptolemy II became the defining hallmark of the Ptolemaic dynasty, setting them apart from all other Hellenistic rulers. Arsinoe even founded a cult in her own honor, a radical innovation for a living queen. Temples were raised in her name, Festivals celebrated her divine marriage. Priesthoods were appointed to preserve her sacred rites. These were not mere acts of vanity, but carefully calculated steps to ensure her power and ideas would live on beyond her lifetime. The end came in 270 BCE, when Arsinoe died at the age of 46. The true cause of Arsinoe's death has been lost to history. It may have been illness, it may have been poison, or perhaps simply the toll of a lifetime spent under immense pressure and constant danger. In the end, what mattered was not how she died, but what she had achieved while alive. Her funeral was nothing short of a royal spectacle. The procession wound through the streets of Alexandria for days, drawing dignitaries and envoys from across the Mediterranean who came to pay their respects. Poets recited verses in her honor. Priests conducted ceremonies in many different languages. The people of Egypt mourned as if they had lost not only a queen, but a goddess. Even in death, Arsinoe's influence only grew stronger. Ptolemy II, bereft of his partner and co-ruler, ensured her memory would endure for eternity. He established a permanent cult in her name. She was deified as Arsinoe Philadelphus, the brother-loving goddess, and her worship was formally incorporated into Egypt's state religion. Temples throughout the kingdom tended her sacred fires. Her image appeared on coins, monuments, and inscriptions for centuries afterward. More importantly, the tradition she had set in motion did not fade. Future Ptolemaic rulers followed her example, marrying their siblings to preserve the divine aura of their dynasty. Over time, the practice became inseparable from Ptolemaic kingship itself, so essential that one could hardly imagine the dynasty without it. Every new sibling marriage stood as a tribute to her memory, an acknowledgement that Arsinoe had discovered the key to legitimacy in a brutal world that respected only power. The tragic irony of her story was complete. The woman once victimized by dynastic incest, forced into marriage by the political schemes of men, had transformed that same practice into the foundation of female authority. What had been a weapon against her became her greatest instrument of power. Centuries later, as the Ptolemaic dynasty finally gave way to Rome, historians continued to debate the tradition she had founded. Some condemned sibling marriage as a violation of natural law, a symbol of decadence that ultimately weakened the dynasty and hastened its collapse. Others admired it as a brilliant political innovation, perfectly adapted to the unique challenges of Hellenistic Egypt, a system designed to preserve royal legitimacy amid endless rivalries and competing claims. Perhaps the most striking tribute to Arsinoe II, however, came much later from an unlikely source. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and began his famous affair with Cleopatra VII, he was struck by the young queen's extraordinary confidence and regal presence. How does she carry herself with such divine assurance? He reportedly asked one of his advisors. The answer, whether spoken aloud or not, was clear. Cleopatra's authority had been shaped by the model that Arsinoe had created centuries earlier. The answer was simple. Cleopatra carried herself with such certainty because she was the heir to a tradition that stretched back almost 3 centuries, a tradition born from a woman who had turned victimhood into triumph. suffering into resilience, and chains into crowns. Cleopatra ruled as she did because Arsinoe II had shown her the way. It was Arsinoe who created the blueprint for Ptolemaic queenship, making such female authority not only possible, but enduring. And that may be the most extraordinary part of Arsinoe's story. She began as nothing more than a pawn in other people's games, trapped by forces far beyond her control. Yet through intelligence, determination, and a nearly superhuman ability to survive, she transformed herself into something utterly new. In the ancient world, a woman who ruled not only as a wife or mother, but by her own merit, her own power, and her own authority. The cost of that transformation was staggering. She sacrificed her children, her youth, her peace of mind, and in many ways, even her humanity. To survive, she had to rise above being merely human. She was compelled to become a goddess, because only divinity could secure her place in the brutal political world she inhabited, yet the achievement matched the sacrifice. Arsinoe created a new model of female power, one that proved a woman could transcend even the most rigid barriers of a patriarchal society. She showed that victimhood did not have to be permanent, and that even the harshest circumstances could be reshaped into stepping stones toward greatness. On the day of her funeral, as the sun set over the Nile and long shadows stretched across the temples where her worship would endure for centuries, the mourners returned home with the memory of a queen unlike any other. She had once been the young woman forced into incest by her father's political ambitions, but she had also become the woman who turned those very ambitions into the foundation of her strength. The bloodline she tried so desperately to preserve through her children did not survive in the way she had hoped. Instead, her legacy lived on through the institution she had forged. Every future Ptolemaic queen who married her brother, every ritual proclaiming the divine nature of royal incest, every coin stamped with the paired images of sibling rulers, all of these were monuments to her memory. They were proof of the price she had paid and of the victory she had won. In death, as in life, Arsinoe II, Philadelphus remained what she had always been, a woman who refused to accept the limits others tried to place on her. She turned chains into crowns. She turned defeat into the foundation for greater power. She was the victim who became a goddess, the pawn who became a queen, the woman who demonstrated that even incest, the ultimate symbol of powerlessness and exploitation, could be reshaped into a source of authority. Her story eventually ended, but her legacy did not. It endured until the fall of the last Ptolemaic pharaoh beneath Roman swords, and even after the dynasty she had strengthened disappeared into history, her influence survived in the records of historians, in the verses of poets, and in the enduring imagination of the world. The young woman, once forced into incest by her father's ambitions, had become the goddess who redefined what it meant to be a queen. In the end, that may have been her greatest victory,